Mum tapped at Mark's bedroom door and put her head round to see what he was doing. The first thing she noticed was a large pile of neatly folded clothes lying on the floor. "When are you going to put away those clean clothes?" she asked. "I ironed them the day before yesterday." She lifted the pile onto the bed. "I thought you were going over to Harry's house. You can't still be doing homework?" Mark mumbled something and shuffled the books on his desk around. Mum came over to have a closer look. She couldn't believe the teacher had given the class such a long geography exercise for homework. "Did everyone have this to do?" she asked suspiciously. Mark tried mumbling again, but eventually he had to admit that this exercise was a punishment for forgetting to do last week's homework. Mum was cross. Mark regularly forgot. She was always telling him to write things down. "But I did write it down," protested Mark. "I just forgot to look at my homework diary." Mum sighed. "Well, if you don't go to Harry's soon, he'll think you forgot that you promised to come. He'll not be worried. Anyway, this is the last question and it will only take 5 minutes to cycle over there." Mum went back downstairs. "Don't forget your helmet, and be careful, that road is so narrow at the Clark's house, and the traffic goes so fast," she called over her shoulder. As Mark had predicted, Harry was not sitting waiting for him. He was expecting Mark, since they had arranged to meet up to work together on their study on the life of Joseph for Bible class, but he was actually on his way to the shower when Mark arrived. Somehow he had never quite got there since the football practice that afternoon. As soon as he had arrived home, there had been a row with his two younger sisters, and then, when they had gone out with his parents after dinner, he had thought he might as well make the most of having the place, and especially the television, to himself. "Make yourself comfortable," he said, tossing Mark the remote. "I won't be long." Mark flicked through the TV channels, but there was nothing to interest him, so he turned his attention to the magazines lying on the table instead. Among the Disney and Pony magazines was a brochure which interested him very much. "Adventure Holidays," it said on the front, and inside were photos of people canoeing and abseiling. He must ask Harry about that. Just then the phone rang. Mark stepped out into the hall. He could tell by the sound of water running in the bathroom that Harry was still in the shower, so he answered the phone himself. "Hello," said a man's voice. "Am I speaking to Mr. Clark?" "I'm very sorry," replied Mark in his best telephone voice. "Mr. Clark is not at home at the moment. Perhaps I could take a message." "I would be grateful if you could. We saw Mr. Clark's advert in this evening's paper. He's selling his caravan and we're very interested in buying it. The only problem is that we're only here for one night. Could I give you the number of the guest house where we're staying, and maybe Mr. Clark could contact me as soon as he comes home?" Mark assured the caller that would be no problem. He lifted a colored pencil from the table and scrawled down the number on the bottom of one of the girls' magazines. "You won't forget to pass on the message?" "I won't forget," promised Mark. He put down the phone and started to look through the holiday brochure again. He was still looking at it when Harry eventually came out of the shower. Harry poured them each a glass of Coke. "Doesn't that look like a fantastic holiday? You stay in these chalets and then every day you can choose what activity you want to do: rock climbing, canoeing, archery, mountain biking, the lot. And the girls can go off swimming or pony trekking or whatever, and I'll hardly need to see them for a whole week. This was said with so much feeling that Mark guessed Harry must have had another argument with his sisters. His own younger sister, Amy, got on his nerves sometimes, but Harry was never done complaining about Emma and Sarah. Maybe it was because they were so much younger than him, or maybe it was because there were two of them and so they either ganged up on their brother, or spent the time squabbling with one another. Harry couldn't stop talking about the adventure holiday. Mark liked the sound of it too. "Are you definitely going?" he asked. "Almost definitely. Though I think it's very expensive." "Help, there's Dad's car. They're back and we haven't even started on Joseph." By the time Mr. and Mrs. Clark walked into the living room, Mark and Harry were sitting together at the table with their Bibles open at Genesis and their notebooks ready. Half an hour later it was time for Mark to go home. He jumped on his bike and cycled off, wondering what plans his own family was making for the summer holidays. He forgot all about the phone call for Mr. Clark, and he was totally unaware that there was another fuss before bedtime in the Clark household when Emma discovered that someone had scribbled on her new magazine. Harry and Mark had been seeing a lot of each other recently. It all began when Dave, their Bible class leader, had decided to pair off everyone in the group to work together on the life of a Bible character. Later each pair was to take turns at telling the rest of the group what they had discovered. One Saturday afternoon in March, Mark called for Harry. As he turned in at the Clark's gate, he could see that Harry was cutting the grass in the front garden, and he could tell from the way that he was going about it that he was not in a good mood. Hardly surprising, thought Mark. It was his job to cut the grass at home too, and the first cut of the year was always the worst. Besides, Harry had much more grass to cut than he had. The Clark's back garden was long and narrow, and the front garden was much the same size. "Hi, Harry. How are you?" Harry didn't answer. Mark tried again. "I was going to ask you to go somewhere with me. But I can see you're busy. I'll give you a hand, if you like." Harry shrugged. "Whatever. Time for the direct approach," decided Mark. "Is it the grass or the sisters?" "Neither," snapped Harry. "It's the holiday." That was bad. "Aren't you going now?" asked Mark. "Unlikely. Not unless there's a change very soon. We haven't booked yet, and there are only a few chalets left for the week Dad's off work. So it looks like another year in the caravan with Emma and Sarah jumped all over me." "Stupid caravan. It's too small for us now, and we wanted to sell it to raise the money for this holiday, but no one seems to want to buy it." "What's wrong with you? Why are you looking like that?" It was too late for Mark to pretend there was nothing wrong, even if he had wanted to. His face had given him away. He had to tell Harry about the man who had been very interested in buying the caravan. "I'm really sorry, Harry. I totally forgot," he finished limply. "Thanks a lot," said Harry bitterly. "You've just cost me the best holiday of my life." "Yeah, thanks a lot." He unhooked the grass box and went round to the back garden to empty it, although it was nowhere near full. Mark took this as his cue to leave. Mum was ironing when he got home. Dad had taken Amy to the swimming pool. Mum wanted to know what was wrong, and Mark told her all about it. "Oh. Mark, I told you all your forgetting was going to get you into trouble. Poor Harry. No wonder he's upset with you. You'll have to go round there and apologize to Mr. and Mrs. Clark, too. Mark turned white. What will they say? I don't know, but it has to be done. Sooner, rather than later. Sooner was straight after dinner. Mark wheeled his bike slowly up to the Clarks' front door. For once he was glad that the garden path was a long one. Sarah answered the door and showed him into the kitchen, where Mr. and Mrs. Clark were drinking tea at the table. Sit down, Mark, offered Mr. Clark in a friendly enough way, but Mark preferred to stand until he had finished the speech he had prepared. After that his legs felt wobbly and he was happy enough to sit down. Mrs. Clark spoke first. We appreciate you coming round to apologize, Mark. That wasn't easy. We can't pretend we're not disappointed about the holiday. It would have been wonderful. And it's easy for us to believe that if you had remembered to pass on this gentleman's message, then we would have sold the caravan. But of course we can't know that for sure. We have to accept things the way they have worked out. Mark looked at her. That seemed a very laid-back attitude. He had expected her to be angrier than that. He risked taking a glance at Mr. Clark to see if he felt the same way. Mr. Clark smiled at him. You see, Mark, when we planned this holiday we prayed that if it was God's plan for us it would work out. But now that it hasn't worked out we have to believe that God has some other plan for our summer. As Christians we have to trust that God always knows what's best for us in the little things and in the big things in life. Our good ideas aren't always what God has planned for us. It's hard not to feel disappointed, interrupted Mark. Of course it is, agreed Mr. Clark, but we have to remember that God can see a much bigger plan of things than we can. He's not out to annoy or hurt us. He loves us and only wants the very best for us. Mark looked doubtful. That holiday looked perfect for all of you. Mrs. Clark nodded. Yes, we thought God was going to give us this lovely holiday. That would have been a good gift. But often God uses experiences we find difficult to teach us important lessons that are useful to us for the rest of our lives. That's God being good to us too. Maybe He wants to teach me to be more responsible, though Mark. Out loud he said, I really wish I had remembered to pass on the message. Perhaps it would help to write things down, suggested Mrs. Clark. Mark bit his tongue and gave her a watery smile. Is Harry around? He asked. He's around somewhere, said Mr. Clark vaguely. Mark took that to mean that he was at home, but didn't want to see Mark. He got up to go. On the way out he heard Mrs. Clark remark quietly, I think Harry may have something to learn here, too. If Harry could have done so, he would have avoided Mark, but his parents insisted that he go to Bible class and youth group, and of course there was the Joseph project to work on. Mark racked his brains for a good way to make things up to Harry. He even asked Mum if they could take Harry on holiday with them, but she said there wasn't room. Forgetting things had never seemed like a big problem before, but now Mark really wanted to change. Inside his wardrobe door, where no one else could see it, he stuck up a sheet of paper where he wrote down the important things he was meant to do. He tried to look at it every morning. No black marks this week, said his teacher one Friday afternoon. Things are improving. Things were improving with Harry, too. He never mentioned the holiday, and he seemed more friendly again. "Okay," said Dave at the end of Bible class one Sunday. "You've all had long enough to get your studies finished." Some of the girls protested. "We've had exams. We've had no time." "Harry and Mark, I know you've been working hard. Next week you can tell the rest of us what you've learned about the life of Joseph." So the next week the boys presented their project to the class. They had made a graph to show the ups and downs in Joseph's life. He started high up as the favorite of his father and fell very low when the jealous brothers sold him as a slave into Egypt. Then there was the up of having a good position in Potiphar's house and the down of being thrown into prison because he was falsely accused. The graph ended on a high with Joseph as Prime Minister of Egypt, able to save the land from famine and to provide a home for his old father and all his brothers. Dave was impressed. "Very good," he said. "And now I want to know what you have learned that could be useful in your own lives." "Mark? When you look at the graph," began Mark, "you might think that God had deserted Joseph at some of the low points. But we learned that the low points were part of God's plan as well as the high points. God had a big plan. Even the brothers trying to kill Joseph couldn't interfere with that plan. At the end of his life Joseph said to them, 'You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good.' And what does that mean for us today?" Dave wanted to know. Even when things go wrong, and we don't get what we want, it doesn't mean God doesn't care about us anymore. We have to believe that He knows best and trust His plan for our lives. Dave turned to Harry. "What have you learnt?" he asked. Mark hoped Harry would be able to think of something to say, as he had already covered most of what they had prepared together. Harry took a deep breath. "I've learned a whole lot," he said. "First of all, like Mark said, we have to trust God when things don't work out the way we want them to, instead of getting cross about it. I'm trying to do that." Then there was the part where the cupbearer forgot to put in a word to Pharaoh about how decent Joseph was, and so Joseph had to spend another 2 years in prison. I think I would have spent the whole time thinking, if it hadn't been for that cupbearer, I'd have been out of here by now. But Joseph didn't waste his time on that. He glanced over at Mark, and Mark felt his cheeks glowing. "Anything else?" asked Dave. This time it was Harry who went red. "Well, yes, there was something else. Joseph's brothers were rotten to him. They planned to kill him and then they sold him as a slave. But he forgave them. As some of you probably know, I have 2 little sisters and we sometimes fight a little." A ripple of laughter went round the room. Everyone knew about Harry and his little sisters. "Well, maybe they're not that bad, and maybe I could be more patient." He looked down at his feet. Perhaps he had said too much. Dave was very pleased. This is exactly what I hoped would happen. When we read the Bible it should speak to us and help us to change the way we live. After that, any awkwardness between the boys disappeared. Mark called at Harry's house the next Saturday. The lawnmower was out again, but Harry was chasing Sarah and Emma round the garden. What have they done now, wondered Mark, and then he realized that the girls were shrieking with laughter, and it was a game. Harry ran over, panting. "Do you have to finish cutting the grass?" asked Mark. This could be the last time I'll ever have to cut all this grass, said Harry mysteriously. Sarah ran up. Guess why, she said. Emma was bouncing up and down. They're going to build a wall, she shouted. Mark looked at them all. Harry kept glancing over his shoulder at the front door. Something exciting was happening, or was about to happen, but Mark had no idea what. At that very moment Mrs. Clark appeared at the door and gave Harry the thumbs-up sign. He jumped round in circles, punching the air. Mrs. Clark was nearly as excited. She ran down the path and hugged the two girls at once. We're going on our adventure holiday after all, she said. Mark stared at Harry in astonishment. How come? He asked. Harry calmed down long enough to explain. The council has been talking about widening the road outside our house for years, because it's too narrow. This morning we had a letter to say that they're going to cut a few meters off our front garden and build us a new wall. So, less grass to cut, and, the best bit of all, they pay us for losing some of our garden. Now we have enough money for the holiday. Mum's just phoned up to see if there was a space left, and there was. But you haven't heard the very best thing yet, said Mrs. Clark, and she looked as if she was about to jump up and down too. There was only one chalet left, and it has 6 beds. I was on the phone with your mum and she says you can come with us, if you'd like to. Harry punched the air again. He caught hold of Emma under the arms and twirled her round and round. I'd love to, said Mark. Wow, he thought. God makes some wonderful plans.